as a field. I was wondering if like, is the reverse situation true? Like, do you guys mostly ignore artificial intelligent
Yeah,
neurons?
yeah. I think that's basically true. So, for example, I was just having a discussion with my supervisor, and um, he was saying, "Oh, my collaborator, who's an experimentalist, and we're like theoretical or computational neuroscientists." And he was saying, "My collaborator, found the Tolman Eichenbaum machine by Stan Barron's group, and is all excited about it. And I don't understand what's novel or interesting about it. Can you help me find that out?" And we chatted a bit, and we're like, "Yeah, well, I mean, it's a fancy biological kind of, you know, version of a hidden Markov model, and that itself is not so interesting from a machine learning or mathematical perspective, but from a biological perspective, it's a new idea. Also, maybe the explicit idea of like sequence prediction um, as a task in a computational neuroscience model is possibly new as well. So there's like like neuroscientists and some computational neuroscientists don't actually maybe too deeply consider what's already come before in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then on the converse, then the same is also true. But maybe I don't know. I
Could
think
you,
there are some.
sorry to interrupt, but
Sorry.
could you quickly define computational? Oh, sorry, is that what you said? Computational neuroscience? Like there's these.
Yeah, it's a bit of an iffy term, but I've heard computational, mathematical, theoretical. What else have I heard? And some of these are synonyms to people, but you know, in in some very boring way, everyone is a computational neuroscientist who does neuroscience because they use a computer at some point to do analysis of their data. But a computational neuroscientist, I think, or a theoretical or mathematical, would if you state that as your identity, it would sort of mean that you don't do wet lab experiments. That is, you don't touch animals or anything, but you might work with data from animals. Um,
But surely
or
then
humans.
it's not the same. It's not synonymous with theoretical neuroscience, though, is it? Or is it?
Some people would use it that way. I don't. I mean, I don't really know what people mean by these things so much anymore because I've just heard so many different things. Like also another thing that I hear a lot of in the fMRI community is like a lot of those people consider themselves computational neuroscientists, although they do, in my opinion, do like physical experiments in like with humans and stuff. But they definitely do a huge amount of data analysis and wrangling, which I suppose earns them their computational title. Not that I think it needs to be earned, but it's curious that they use that title to me because it's not like they're not doing experiments like with humans, for example.
Mm. Yeah, sorry, I
Um,
interrupted you though, answering the earlier question about the relation
it's
between
all good. Yeah,
ML.
I think I think that's a it's a nice free flowing Q and A. So any or all questions at any time. But yeah, on the converse of the direction of like machine learners not getting influence from like natural learners, let's say, um, then or human learners, I think yeah, it's kind of there's different schools of thought. Like people like Jeff Hinton, for example, expressly state that that he's interested in the brain and how it works. So it seems to me that he's inherently interested in neuroscience and psychology. Um, but there are other people. Um, uh, I think Joe might say something similar, but there are other people that definitely say that the opposite. They say no, we should like maybe Rich Sutton is a good example. Like
Mm.
throw away everything that we should care about the brain. We shouldn't use that. We should just follow, for example, reinforcement learning principles or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
it seems a bit funny in Sutton's case, given that maybe the one clear point of contact between neuroscience and machine learning is the connection between dopamine and reward learning and all that. Sort of like a
Yeah,
clear success story, very much tied up in Sutton's
right.
own work. But yeah, it's interesting to reflect on the difference between, say, OpenAI, which as far as I can tell, has zero inspiration from neuroscience or interest in it internally, at least in terms of their official research program. With DeepMind, which was explicitly founded very much with the idea that we should take inspiration from neuroscience, not only Demis Hassabis's background, but just in terms of their hiring and so on. How would you say that's sort of shaken out? I mean, I guess one reading of some of the recent, realignment of investment in machine learning and AI maybe looks from the outside like it's a loss for DeepMind's perspective on trying to take inspiration from the brain, and a victory for the no. We know all we need to know about artificial neurons. We'll just scale up now.
Yeah. So, sorry, what was the question there?
Yeah, I guess the question is, I mean, do you think the equilibrium has changed sort of in the relationship between neuroscience and AI? I mean, in terms of the people saying that you can ignore neuroscience, feel like they've got renewed vigor as a result of the dominance of transformers and so on over the last few years?
Yeah, maybe. Although it's also curious that a lot of people in computational theoretical, whatever, neuroscience, let's just say neuroscience, are also trying to make mappings or attach relevance of their work to transformers. And I don't necessarily treat it as completely skeptical that transformers are doing something basically like what the brain does, but obviously it has some different transformations and other things going on. But the brain is definitely more complicated than transformers, and it uses a lot less power. It uses obviously different algorithms. It learns for example. Sorry?
I'm not a biologist, but I assume that your brain isn't like a fully forward object like transformers are.
Yeah. Well, actually, there is one part of the brain which has the majority of the neurons, actually, which is the cerebellum. And that is famously very feed forward.
Okay. What does that do against me?
Well, it's involved with learning, but also in particular, like motor learning, especially, or motor actions. And maybe actually just while I think of it, so I don't forget, there was a nice paper called Attention Approximates Sparse Distributed Memory by Trenton Bricken. That's it. And I'm going to post that. There was a Neurops a couple of years ago, I believe, or a year ago or something. I'm just going to post that here. And so sparse distributed memory is quite a forgotten model of the cerebellum, which is this brain area that I just mentioned. So, it appears that more than just hot field networks, but also, Tim Behrens' work, they and James Winnington, they published something saying that their Tolman-Eichenbaum machine can be, recast as a transformer. There's lots of these, attention is all you need is really just saying blah from neuroscience, which we already knew. But also I think a lot of people from other fields, like I thought Jürgen Schmid, I can never say his last name, Jürgen.
You again, Schmidhuber.
Schmidhuber, yeah.
Have you not read his webpage? You should pronounce his first name correctly. He's very particular about it.
Oh, sorry. Am I mispronouncing it?
Yeah, it's you again.
Oh, you again? Really?
Yeah, that's how he says it should be pronounced. Yeah.
Is that just a troll? Because it's like that's just him in a nutshell, right? Oh, it's you again, saying something about we should listen to our past more.
I don't know.
But his lab produced a paper which was something about like feed-forward networks are also doing attention, or can be thought of as attention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll try to find that later. I can't find it live.
What would you say are it's maybe not exactly the area you're paying attention to, but from your point of view, what have been the successes in terms of ideas from theoretical neuroscience that have made their way out into broader mathematics or machine learning. I mean, I guess I would count Hopfield networks perhaps as a success in that direction, although Hopfield was sort of not exactly a neuroscientist, right? But like maybe would not have worked on the things he worked on without some input from people in neuroscience. I mean, I forget the exact history, but I think maybe you could recall briefly the story with dopamine and how that inspired some progress in RL. I don't know which direction that story went exactly at the various parts. Maybe you know better than me.
Well, yeah, reinforcement learning, I can say fairly confidently started in neuroscience as an experimental observation about how if you associate some reward with some stimulus, and then after a time only present the stimulus, you still observe the dopamine, which is the reward signal. And there's also like prediction and something called TD learning, temporal difference learning, which resulted from that work, and then a whole bunch of computational work which followed through. And originally it was in very simple, situations or computational models like grid world environment was like very famously used for a while, but of course more sophisticated things. And I would say DeepMind sort of are the forerunners of all those advanced reinforcement learning stuff now. Yeah, but in terms of other theoretical contributions from neuroscience, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard for me to track discretely ideas in the sense that I see sometimes that it seems like a similar intuition is just formulated differently. Like machine learners sometimes will say things like, memories are like graphs, and different memories are on the graph, and the relations between these memories are like the edges or something. And then you'll hear someone like a neuroscientist say, oh well, the hippocampus is really like a graph, and or they won't maybe use the same word as graph, or the network, whatever. So yeah, I think it's hard for me to discretely describe one way or the other different things, but through the precise histories you can probably track those things. But I can't necessarily recall all of them because they all get quite jumbled up in my mind as someone that's living between those two worlds, it seems.
Yeah, it does seem to me like the history of attention as an idea is very interesting, and not even Schmidhuber has really written about it very systematically. I think many people just aren't aware. I mean, I guess the Hopfield Networks is All You Need paper did quite a bit to bring to the surface those historical connections, but I think for many...
they kind of, sorry to interrupt, but they kind of did also make some mistakes. Like they said that they were the first to introduce a continuous modern Hopfield network when actually it was already introduced. Also, they made a few kind of overclaims or underclaims on their behalf and others' behalf, respectively. But that's just a small note.
Yeah, that's probably true. But
which is not to assign malice to that. It's just yeah.
But I think it probably remains underappreciated the degree to which attention goes back to the Ising model fundamentally, and like how much it owes to statistical mechanics, and via that, via Hopfield, and that whole history leads up somehow to attention in NLP sort of being in the air, and then then you could have the idea of let's only use attention, and that's of course what transformers are all about. So like with many ideas, it can seem to come out of nowhere, but there's sort of because I was sort of looking at the NLP literature before the transformer, and I paid a lot of attention to the neural Turing machine, and so the neural Turing machine also had attention in it, and was sort of trying to use that in similar ways to the transformer in the end. And the authors there clearly I mean, they were people coming from the NLP community and the NLP community. I don't know, like the original attention paper in NLP, I don't know if it explicitly cites any of the older work, like Hopfield's work. So maybe there actually is a case of independent invention there.
I think it was independently discovered, but I think they were coming from a perspective of like attention literature, and it turns out, it seems to me in my rough approximation, that the type of attention that they're talking about is really just kind of like attractor dynamics or something. And that's a particular type of attention. That's fine to talk about. And then they just sort of like put in lots of attractors and try to pack a lot of attractors in there, and then add some nonlinear transformations and stack these different attractor sort of networks together. And then that's what gets them the results.
Yeah, I think that's an intuition that you, as coming from a neuroscience background or someone steeped in Hopfield networks, has, that it's about building attractors and therefore kind of reconstructing. I mean, the line between reconstruction and generalization is kind of interesting. But so the original version of the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine paper, for example, which didn't refer to transformers, so maybe that's just the whole paper didn't. The newer work, I guess, recast it in that way. But the original paper was using, I forget the name, fast weights. There's a paper by Hinton and Jimmy Barr, I think, and another guy. Basically, I think it's called fast weights for... Yeah, there's like the idea... I mean, that's another input into the...
Using fast weights to attend to the recent past?
Yeah, that's it, yeah. So that's very much, and again, I don't know if they're citing Hopfield, but it's very much informed by that idea of iterating some sort of mapping like that in order to sort of have two time scales on which you're doing computation based on, like, a bit hard to describe, but quite neuroscience-y, I would say, the flavor of that paper. And when I talked to Tim Behrens and Whittington about it, they clearly grokked that paper, and that's why it was an ingredient in their Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, because it fit into the theoretical neuroscientists' toolkit of ideas in a way that maybe the transformer didn't quite, because of the nonlinearities or whatever. But yeah, you can see how there's a lot of overlap between these communities, but maybe they proceed alongside each other, largely in ignorance of each other, apart from a few people who kind of live in the overlaps. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that, I think. But I mean, I'm not unique in this. Like there is a non-zero number. Well, I'm clearly one of them, but there's clearly a number of people who think along these lines, and they're also using this phrase neuro AI a lot to describe themselves.
What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but it kind of means something like between between neuroscience and AI, and using ideas from both to sort of inform the other, which of course is kind of like how I describe myself, but I don't know. I think many people mean different things about these different words. Like I've just posted another thing in the Neuro channel on our Discord about it's a nice review article actually about the idea of attention from different perspectives of psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning. And I just thought about it before, but
cool. Thanks.
But I don't know. It's just it's so hard to nail down how these ideas really like track them down to their original, people. And I think there's a lot of independent works that pop up. And Neuro AI is just a brand name for I think it's also a brand name for like people who are interested in both, but also people who think that there is no difference almost between both those things or something like that. or there ought to be no difference between the study of those things.
Yeah, okay. Now we have like 3 interesting avenues to go on. What you just mentioned was something like the idea of universality, right? That maybe, I mean, if it's possible that there are fundamentally completely alien ways to solve these problems, then studying what's happening inside a large language model would be just orthogonal to studying what's happening inside the brain, potentially, right?
Right.
What do you think the dot product between those two things is? Is it 0 or is it 1?
It's not 0. It's not 0 and it's not 1. I think it varies, of course, a lot on the models that you use. But for example, like the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, it's a fancy biologically inspired hidden Markov model, in my opinion, and it pops out place cells and grid cells and time cells and lots of things. And those are bounded biological systems, and therefore we say, okay, well, maybe there's some agreement here, or like the optimizers, even though they're working in different ways and there's more complications and differences, maybe on this fundamental level they're similar. But yeah, I think it depends on the system.
Would you say that's a view widely shared by computational neuroscientists? I mean, it would be convenient if it's true, if you're a computational neuroscientist, right? Given that means you don't necessarily have to wait for the experimentalists to do everything, because you have some other models you could study. So I guess you'd be inclined to maybe believe it, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically fair. I mean, that's essentially, yeah. I mean, So there's an interesting question, very fundamentally, like almost a philosophy of science question here about like what is a model, and like how do you find out something about the natural world? Because when experimentalists complain to computational neuroscientists, for example, that what you're doing is just studying a model, I can say to them, yeah, but you're just also studying a model. It happens to be that it's a biological model, and I'm studying a computational model. Like, do we really think that lab rats are the same as wild rats in all places in the world? The best model of my pet cat is that cat.
But surely another cat is a lot closer to your cat than, cat NN version 3.5.
maybe, but then it's a question of what do you care to know, or like what are you trying to model? Like what's the question that you're trying to answer? There it might actually be for different practical reasons better to study the cat NNN or whatever, how many N's there was. Neural network. Should be 2 N's. Yeah. I notice Chaotic Triangle has posted something. Oh yes, I know this paper. And in fact, I presented on this in a journal club, so let me try to find my talk slides so that I can remind myself. Journal clubs. What's the name of that? Single cortical neurons as deep artificial neural networks. Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah.
So this was interesting. So it's basically cortical neurons are well approximated by these deep neural networks with 5 to 8 layers. And they use a deep convolutional network, in particular a temporal convolutional network. It seems pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it's not a new idea necessarily at all to try to use some sort of more simple, computationally speaking, model than a biologically or biophysically somewhat realistic model. And the main reason that you want to do this kind of work, I think, from a practical perspective is, well, one reason I should just say is it's cheaper to run those models then, and to maybe find out some like network level behavior that you couldn't do because it was like computationally too costly to do the biophysical models. That is like the more complicated models that these approximate. But those biophysical models, of course, just approximate the physical biological neural networks, like the cat NNN just approximates the cat. The things they found out in this paper seem to be, just that. Well, they sort of, I think, highlighted some things that we already knew from biological experiments, like, for example, that dendritic branches can be conceptualized as sets of spatiotemporal pattern detectors and like functionally sort of distinct. That's kind of something that we think fairly widely appreciate now in neuroscience. And yeah, I mean, they also have a nice computational model for, a more efficient computational model for studying these types of complicated neurons in a cheaper way, which is also cool.
Maybe this is a different paper, but I seem to remember maybe it's that paper or a similar paper making the point that sometimes when people are looking for, trying to figure out in what year will artificial neural networks be as good as a human, they compare the number of neurons, and since biological neurons are potentially themselves basically like feed-forward networks with some number of weights, it's not really appropriate to. I mean, maybe it's doesn't change the calculation much because it's just like a multiple of 5 or something, but certainly it's true, right, that biological neurons are vastly more complex potentially than just the artificial version.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Do you think
that's...
Sorry, go on.
Sorry. Just to sort of put some language around that, in the computational neuroscience community, we call the neurons that most artificial neural networks use point neurons, since they just have like a single number attached to them. And then you can, add like what we call a stick to that. So it's like you have like some single dendrite, which is a very simple model, but still vastly more, has vastly more phenomena that are associated with those sorts of models, just by having a second component to the, like a second spatial component to the single neurons. And then of course you can go up to there, and typically, the average so-called biophysical model in a software package confusingly called Neuron, all capitals, which makes it hard to Google. But that might have something like 10,000 compartments. That means like 10,000 of these little spatial things that are tracking the voltage, but not just the voltage, but also like the concentration of particular ions and things. And you can have dozens of ions and channels, and it's really, really sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
But sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry, so like, were you saying just then that like to have some sense of what a neuron is doing, it has like something of the order of like 10,000 degrees of freedom?
Well, not necessarily. It could be have much more, really. As it turns out, actually, 10,000 is I'm not a numerologist or something, but there are 10,000 around about on an average pyramidal neuron, which is one of the main kind of neurons that are involved in neural function in the brain. They have around 10,000 synapses onto them, as it turns out. So you could think about it as like there's a 10,000 dimensional vector of inputs, but there's probably even more than that, because there's astrocytes, there's neuromodulators, there's there's glucose, there's lots of like metabolic things. I struggle to imagine how you could describe, accurately a single neuron with less than 1 million parameters. But I might be completely wrong there, but I just don't know how you could well describe it as, to the same computational complexity as without, let's say, 1 million, probably more parameters, but this is a complete guess.
Yeah, and nonetheless, you had the courage to become a computational neuroscientist. Aren't you just daunted by that system?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Funnily enough, although that's like how I kind of describe myself, I'm sort of trending towards something like, I don't know, something like theoretical neuroscientist, and then maybe even like trying to take on the idea that artificial neural networks are a fair way to study the brain, and that they are interesting in and of themselves for other reasons. And so, yeah, I'm also interested in like interpretability of AI, and actually some of you I've chatted with already about that. But yeah.
So here, why don't I try and sell you on a cult and see if you join. So here's the beliefs of the cult. The universe is full of mathematical structure by the nature of its governing laws and the symmetries involved in them, and then any sufficiently capable learning machine just exposed to the laws of physics and the underlying mathematical structures will sort of absorb over time, maybe evolutionary time, maybe shorter if you're training it artificially, just absorbs that structure into the internal structure of its learning system, and then comes to reflect it much in the way that, I guess Plato or Pythagoras would have thought, that mathematics, which is after all the product of the human mind, reflects the true nature of the things out there in the world. Okay, that's what the cult believes, but then there's the question of, well, how much is contingent and how much isn't? I mean, is it, you could think that's true of like in the limit, right? If you take a super huge artificial neural network and you train it on, the positions of every particle in the solar system for 100 million years, that's so much data that you look inside that system and that's basically Plato's heaven sitting in there, right?
Right.
But maybe that's not true of people because, well, it's like a tiny mushy thing inside a skull, and maybe you don't need all that profound stuff in there in order to just chase rabbits and not die. Do you think it's a continuum there, or do you think would you expect that more intelligent things kind of reflect more of the geometry and algebra and topology you like, and maybe there's not so much of it in rabbits? Or is it just kind of actually there's a pretty low bar where if you need to navigate in the world, then there's a lot of geometry in there pretty quickly?
Yeah, I think the latter, but I don't discount that there might be some sort of phase.
You cut
situation.
out. Sorry, go back to phase transition. You cut out on the audio.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't discount that there might be big differences that happen and phase transitions that happen at certain scales. Also, so in that way, it may not be strictly continuous, maybe. But also, I think ultimately it just depends on the ecological niche or the environment and tasks that you are in, and the sort of meta optimizer that sort of applies to you as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Do you think when systems, I mean, this includes both artificial systems and natural ones, when they train on things, I mean, when they're exposed to things like social hierarchies, and they sort of use geometric or topological ideas to represent them, as you've talked about in this series of talks, and that's not only in, I mean, that's in real, I mean, people have done actual experiments and seen this in people's brains and rats' brains, and also in these simulations that you've talked about. Do you think that's a reflection of something? I mean, social hierarchies are also created by people, right? Is it like is it a sort of circular argument in a way where because of navigation we kind of structure all the things we do? It's just like we're lazy, and many things come to reflect the internal structures that evolve for that reason? Or is it something deeper than that, where it's sort of like many things in the world, the simplest way to organize them tends to express some of these simple mathematical patterns? Where do you think it's from?
So my supervisor is sort of in love with log normal distributions, so heavy tail distributions of things. For example, like log normal distributions of weights in a neural network, or durations of activities, or like in neurons, or the intervals between. Actually, that's, I think, a power law. But he's interested in these kind of like basically non-Gaussian, like heavy tail sort of distributions in things. And as a old school statistical physicist, I think he sort of just believes that's the way that nature sort of operates. It sort of has to settle on situations, perhaps sometimes, which, you know, there are some really big things and there's some like a lot of smaller things. So yeah, I'm not sure if I totally agree or not. Definitely, it appears to be the case in some situations. As to whether or not social hierarchies need to have like a non-Gaussian distribution, I have no idea. Of course, a communist would say no, it should be flat. But yeah, I don't know.
Tom says the social organization with the most interesting topology is
Yeah,
the
that's
optimal.
what I think, actually. I don't know.
Higher homology groups. We need more.
Yeah. I will say, yeah, just as a point of interest, this paper that I'm posting now is also an interesting fMRI study, although I don't like fMRI studies in general. But I like fMRI scientists, I just don't like fMRI studies. In fact, yeah, I like all scientists and people, but I just don't like some work.
What's up with fMRI? It's like the science of looking at splotches and making bold claims, or what?
It's like the science of noticing a dead fish is thinking of Plato or something. It's just really spurious correlations a lot of the time, and huge amounts of data shenanigans and data processing stuff. That's like a very simple thing, just to, peek into the complexity, is each of our brains are physically different, and yet when we do an fMRI study, we have to average over our brains. So how do we smooth out those physical differences, or map between them? I think that the huge complexity of not only those individual differences from a psychological perspective, but also a physical and neuroscientific perspective, is just insurmountable almost to properly study with fMRI, let alone the actual neurophysiological basis of fMRI being like the bulb signal, the blood oxygen level dependent signal, being a fairly indirect signal. It's not like spikes or something like that, and people accept that, I think, but they still do all this. So actually, if you don't know, there's a very, very famous, I think it's the dead salmon.
Oh, that's right. Yes. I didn't get the dead salmon reference the first time, but now I remember.
Sorry, yeah, I think I said dead fish, so
Yeah.
here we go. I'll post that for anyone interested who doesn't know. But people put a dead salmon in a fMRI machine and found like some spurious correlations, and just sort of put this as an example of how ridiculous it is that people do these sorts of studies, or not necessarily do these sorts of studies, because they can be actually, in some ways, these are like some of the most important studies, or the studies we should care the most about, because they directly affect us, right? They're directly on humans, and we are humans, so presumably we care about ourselves. But the techniques we do to sort of get to those conclusions about, here's the brain that lights up when you think about Jesus or something, it's really difficult to weigh a lot of confidence on that, I think.
Yeah, let me ask a mean question. Okay, so
Sure.
Pharmaceuticals, drug discovery, an enormous percentage of that literature is either fraud or just bullshit or simply wrong. And it's only really discovered because companies try to actually use that knowledge to make drugs, and they find it doesn't work. So there's a downstream customer that's actually much more invested in the truth than the scientists are. They have all sorts of incentives. They need to publish, they want to go to conferences, get slaps on the back, seem like they're doing something, have careers. And we know that not in all cases that corresponds with honesty. It's not necessarily that people are faking results, but there can be a tacit understanding that we won't ask very tough questions all the time. I could look at neuroscience and say, well, there's actually no downstream customer where this is actually cashing out in any way that you could really tell if it's all bullshit. And I do feel a little bit leery, not only of fMRI studies, but even like the grid cell literature. I look at it and it's like, it starts off, the story is really elegant and very attractive, and then year after year it sort of just gets more baroque and complicated. And by now it kind of almost seems like the original story is, I don't know, like it just feels very hard to know if there's a real thing. Whereas there's clearly like a role for the narrative in allowing you to get a grip on the complexity, but it's just so complex that you can never quite be sure if that story is like actually a good approximation or really just quite misleading. And just to give another example, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time looking at like single cell like RNA data and like gene regulatory networks, and it's a similar issue there where you can tell all sorts of stories about what various circuits in cells are doing, but at the end of the day I think most of those papers just basically don't say anything. And often, I mean, in many cases it's you can show that that's true. I have a friend whose favorite hobby is to show that the consequences of papers in that area, the claims are entirely a result of the way you chose to cluster the signals, right? Like you have to choose various cutoffs, and then you have to bin things, and you apply some like all sorts of cleaning pipelines, and many people don't know what's in those pipelines. And then when you actually look closely at it, like the results are just completely a consequence of all those ad hoc choices, and there's nothing actually real. So I don't want to shit on your field or anything, but I'm just like you must believe in it nonetheless. So I want to hear like the story.
Well, I actually basically 100% agree with what you just said, and also I feel sad that's the case. So I just want to say something perhaps more general before going into that. And what I sort of heard from what you're saying, which I think is like true not just of neuroscience but of many fields, empirical ones in particular, is that like there's a lot of analogies and narratives and metaphors and framing that goes on. And for example, if you take like Neuro AI, which is this recently popularized term which refers to the intersection of interest, techniques, and results, let's say, in neuroscience and AI, it's argued by some, for example, that ANNs can directly contribute to neuroscience or cognitive science, not only by providing predictions and explanations of cognitive phenomena, but also by enabling a kind of mechanistic exploration of how learning systems generate such phenomena. Some researchers aiming to, let's say, better understand or improve AI systems also regularly express that they draw inspiration from neuroscience. But from the perspective of like philosophy of science and mathematics, it seems that, for example, Neuro AI therefore promotes a particular set of narratives and analogies, like and more particularly still like a particular like equality between particular analogies or metaphors or narratives. And generally speaking, such narratives and analogies, including how they are framed, I think, can play a pivotal role in influencing our engagement in those ideas and the underlying subject matter and how we interpret the results. And so I think actually a deeper analysis of those, like not only the narratives, analogies, and metaphors themselves, but also like those linguistic properties that we sort of admit that they sort of contain, or like the social things that are caused downstream from that, those sorts of analogies and so on, could be sort of a good thing to sort of explore rigorously. So, something I'm actually doing with some philosophers in collaboration. Recently I've been thinking about this particular confluence of ideas. And one thing that I'm interested to do is in that case, note like what's the historically common practices in the updating of these metaphors and analogies. And so far, it seems to me, for example, the analogy of, for example, like there are these things called head direction cells in the brain, or they're called head direction cells. I don't know if they exist, but there are these cells that people. There are these cells in the particular set of animals that were experimented on in, let's say, the 90s, and people called them head direction cells. That's actually what's the case. Whether or not we have head direction cells, I don't know. But in these studies, they showed that if you put the animal in a certain orientation, that a particular cell will fire, indicating its sort of head is in that direction. And the analogy that they seem to be sort of making is to that of a compass, for example. But it seems now it's sort of we're updating our analogies and our narrative, which is something like ultimately sequence prediction on structures, underlying structures of the world, let's say, in the case of neuroscience. So does that mean that head direction cells exist or not? I don't know. Is that still a helpful or practically useful idea for the time being? Maybe. I think some of this kind of also brings up to me the sort of idea of like what should we discretize or what should we focus on? For example, when you do a neuroscientific experiment, you have a particular hypothesis or idea of what you're studying, and you therefore ignore 99.9% of what's happening, and you focus on some particular set of things. The same, I guess, is true in many empirical fields. You try to control it for everything else or ignore everything else and focus on a few little levers or buttons or whatever that you press and play with to understand just those fundamental things. And I guess an open question is, how do you choose those things to care about? Most of the time in these empirical sciences, you care about them for some practical reason, I think. But do grid cells still have a relevance, or are they still the right analogy to, move us forward in some practical direction? I don't know.
But you evaded my question. Is half of neuroscience wrong, Tom?
No, I don't think so. Or more precisely, it is, yes, technically speaking, but that doesn't make it not useful. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, in another sense, you could say it's correct or it's right.
In the sense that all science proceeds by wrong analogies that are just a little bit better than the previous wrong analogies, perhaps, but that itself is a pretty optimistic take on many areas of science, I would say.
Well, was Churchill being optimistic when he said democracy is the worst form of government?
Yeah, that's okay. That's Tom Burns's weak source endorsement of science. It's the least stupid way of trying to get to the truth. That could be
right. By the way, we've touched on politics twice at least. Now I'm not sharing any political opinions. I don't know. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah, sure. I'll let you off the hook with that. Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because one way of thinking about that is in terms of just like how reliable is science, and is society is society's investment in it justified, or is it like a big Ponzi scheme or welfare for smart people? But aside from that, there's also a very fundamental question of as we approach systems like the brain that are just way more complicated than, say, the dynamics of balls following a parabola, it's not so clear that we know what we mean by understand. Or, I take your point with when you're talking to the experimentalist. So when you're talking about they're ultimately just studying a model as well. I take it you mean that criticism is very much rooted in the choice of what to throw out, so that the very act of measurement is in a way fundamentally entwined with a model, in a way that maybe they don't take seriously enough. And as those models become themselves very complicated, I feel a little overwhelmed by the task in some sense, and that's very much, interpretability for neural networks very much has the same problem, right?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. A practical, useful analogy, perhaps.
All right, other questions?
I guess like on what people said, made me think about people's ideas of interpretability for neural networks seems like as hard as interpretability for the brain, which, except for the fact that I guess the brain is much larger. But I was wondering if anything in like, if Tom, anything in like not psychology, but maybe like neurology or stuff would be good for what we know to interpret. Because we have some sense of like we can interpret the brains in some regards. I was wondering if you think that like has any carryover at all to maybe not mechanistic interpretability, but just interpretability. Oh,
Yeah. So, sorry, what was the last bit?
Oh, sorry, this little chaotic tangle asked a question in the Discord after me.
Okay, all right. I'll come to that question next, chaotic triangle. But yeah, as for your question, Ben, yeah, I think there's a lot, and I think so. One thing that like machine learners have been doing for quite a while are like ablation studies, right? Where you just zero out the weights in a feed-forward pass within some subsection of the network. And that's kind of how early neurology and neuroscience started. They found people that had a horrible accident, like lobotomized accidentally. There was a famous patient that had like a pole shoved through his frontal cortex and then had like, very particular behavior, and that taught them something about frontal cortex. But also there was a famous patient called HM who had the hippocampus destroyed, and that taught psychologists and neuroscientists a lot about how important the hippocampus was for different psychological phenomena. So ablation studies are already being done, as far as I can see. The question that might be interesting to study next is kind of like from a more neuroscientific perspective, like a cellular perspective, would be the activities of individual neurons. I guess they kind of do that too, right? Like in the convolutional neural networks, they find individual, they do like, I forgot what it's called now, the technical name, but like they try to highly activate one individual downstream neuron, like in the middle of this convolutional neural network, and find that it's highly activated by cattails or something, some particular feature. So there actually are already some ideas, really, that I think you could relate to neuroscience, which are already being done. As for what more can be done, well, for example, I think that and I think I mentioned this in the Neuro channel already, that my reading of Anthropic AI's paper, what was it called? Something superposition.
Oh, twin models of superposition.
Yeah. So really nice paper, love it. But boy, could they use a little bit more neuroscience. Like fundamentally, it seems to me, and I might be wrong, I might be misunderstanding something fundamental here, but it seems to me that exactly what they're interested in is something that people like Karina Curto and Nora Youngs have been working on from the perspective of, I will admit, completely theoretical mathematical models of neuroscience. And that relates to my fourth project, which I presented last week. Or tried to. Sorry again if it was bad.
Could you link the work of the two people you just referred to in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, and I'm not really. I suppose I haven't even explained why I think that.
Yeah, sorry.
But yeah, that's okay. No. Yeah, that wasn't the. complaining, but I was just noticing that I haven't actually explained why I think that.
Yeah, we're
I
very
think the
interested
best
in that
place to
paper.
start-
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to say that we're very interested
That's
in
all
that paper, so maybe at some other time we can talk at greater length about your thoughts about it. And
Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
Okay. I should say, like, it's not just these two people, Karina Koto and Nora Youngs, but I've just posted what I think is like the best introduction to their way of thinking in their work in the channel.
Awesome, thank you.
Did I answer your question, Ben, or was there something else that I missed?
I think you did, but now I'm more interested in this link to the toy models paper that you mentioned. But maybe,
yeah, I think that might be a
answer.
good topic to return to at length sometime, since we should probably get to Chaotic Tangle's question and then maybe wrap up.
Yeah.
So the question in the chat, in case you didn't see it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Is that the chat of
It's
Roblox
Discord.
or
No.
of Discord? I see.
So the question was, what
and
do
sorry,
you
I
think
think I
about
was
the?
calling you I think I was calling you Chaotic Triangle, but I completely misread it, and it's Chaotic Tangle. Sorry for that. So let me have a look at this. The entropic brain, a theory of conscious states informed by neuroimaging research with psychedelic drugs. Sounds fishy, and it's a hypothesis and theory article in Frontiers. I have published in Frontiers, but I will never publish again because I don't like their business model, just FYI, so I'm probably already biased. And also, it's a neuroimaging trial. It's like, yeah, I'm very biased already, just so you know.
It's another word for
I would have to read this more closely, but it's not looking like my assessment would be positive at all.
On a related note, what do you think about the free energy principle and Friston and all that? You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, I know. So, political reasons, I will say that no comment, or no, I can say more than no comment. But I like the fact that people want to make consciousness research more mathematical, and I like the fact that the free energy principle is a mathematical, construct. And I don't think it's correct, but I like that people are trying to do that work, and I hope that people do more of that work.
I wouldn't have automatically thought it was deeply related to consciousness. So, I mean, you could adopt the free energy principle and so on as a point of view for making predictions about why learning machines would be the way they are without necessarily invoking consciousness. But is that a place where people try to make use of this principle? I wasn't aware of that.
Quite extensively from my experience, but
I see.
You're right. I guess you don't. Yeah, like people don't have to bring up consciousness at all in the free energy principle discussion. But I think it is also too simplistic just on its own to explain behavior. In the same way as like reinforcement learning is too simplistic to explain all behavior. Like Rich Sutton is equally wrong, but it's still equally useful and practically useful or whatever. And I encourage people to keep, exploring those directions. It's not something that I'd probably work on. But,
so yeah. the one true principle is not free energy or reinforcement learning, but simplicial structure.
I don't know if I'd be brave enough to say that there's any single thing yet that I'm aware of. The only thing I know is like these general principles of like embodiment seems important, timing seems important, relational structures seem important. Reinforcement, I don't know, possibly free energy. That like there's a lot of principles. Whether or not you can derive a more fundamental principle than all those, I don't know. I think part of the problem for theoretical work in neuroscience is that our measurements are, not precise enough, and they're very, like in the experiments. And so whenever you come up with some theory, it has to be, it can't be, well, if it's way more precise and particular than all the experimental evidence, then people are going to discount it as like completely detached from reality. And if it fits very well with the evidence, people will just say, okay, that's what we already know. So you have to go somewhere in between, it feels like, strategically. But yeah, I mean, these are messy systems. It's hard to say. I think this is when it comes back to sort of like these analogies and narratives, and whether or not something's particularly or practically useful or not.
So here's a question about the aim of your own, I mean, what the sort of deep motivating force for your own research is. So suppose that we completely understood a very sophisticated learning machine, maybe it's GPT-7, which is superhuman, but because of some universality reasons is easier to understand, and you can look inside it and you can see all the simplices and the free energy and the reinforcement learning and how it all fits together and how it emerges from first principles. And it's this amazing story, and there's an 800-page textbook, and you read it and you go, okay, I've got it. But it's not the brain, because the brain is smaller and for all sorts of ad hoc evolutionary reasons and all sorts of constraints, has all sorts of strange details that aren't the same as that universal system. You'd be satisfied with the 800-page textbook, or you'll be like, no, that's not the brain. I want to understand the brain.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think I still will want to understand the brain after that, but I would suspect that we would be significantly farther along in understanding the brain by having that 800-page textbook about GPT-7 or whatever. Yeah. I mean,
Cool.
it's a bit like, yeah, I mean, it's a bit like how, but there are big differences, right? But I'd say a big part of our increased understanding might be just in the techniques we develop along the way. Analytical and so on, since like there's not much that's similar, let's say, between like an anthropod's brain and a human brain. I'm not saying that's necessarily the scale of difference between us and GPT-7. It might be, but the techniques that we use and we discover, and the principles we discover and use in understanding human brains, tends to help us understand, let's say, ants or whatever.
All right, I think we should probably wrap up, and I want to thank you very much, Tom, for this series of talks and for taking the time to explain all this to us noobs. I got a lot out of this, and I hope this is just, I'm sure we will have many more conversations about this in the future. Yeah, so thanks a lot.
No worries. Yeah, thank you all for coming along. I'm traveling to Rwanda tomorrow for the ICLEI conference, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we can do a bit more of these sessions, or I can join for some other sessions that you guys talk about topics that we all care about. That'd be cool.
Cool. Yeah, good luck at the conference. I'm sure you'll have lots of people to talk to.
Yeah.